Olá a todos, boa tarde. Meu nome é Rita Faden, sou Presidente da FLAD, Fundação Luso-Americana para o Desenvolvimento, e é um gosto ter-vos aqui connosco esta noite para ouvirmos o Viet Thanh Nguyen. Obrigada. Okay, sorry, peço desculpa. Okay, so now in English, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here at FLAD, Luso-American Development Foundation. And in our series Meet the Author, we have the pleasure of welcoming Viet Thanh Nguyen, that will talk us about his books, his experience as the son of refugees in the United States, and he makes us think about the power of memory and the presence of being simultaneously having two identities at the same time, and all the challenges and also the richness that implies. So we are here to hear you both, and I also thank, of course, Isabel Lucas, who is the soul behind Meet the Author, who has been with us from the beginning, and which we want to thank very much for this partnership. From our side, I think we are very happy and we want to continue. So thank you, and we are here we want to listen to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to everybody here for coming out. I'm thrilled to be in Lisbon with Isabel Lucas, who's been my interlocutor for at least a couple of occasions now.
Yes.
Yeah.
But thank you, Viet Thanh Nguyen. I was trying with Rita to understand how to pronounce his name, but this is not in Vietnamese formula. This is in English formula. I don't know. I guess it's something like Nguyen. Yeah, do you say in Vietnamese?
Nguyen. Pretty good.
So we are very happy to have Viet Nguyen here. I'm going to introduce him, but before that, I would like you to read an excerpt of his new book that will be launched in this fall in United States. It's a memoir. The title is The Man of Two Faces. Please.
Well, in fact, the book, I just finished writing that book, A Man of Two Faces, and it was a very difficult book for me to write because it is a memoir, which means that it deals with, well, let me just put it this way. I hope none of you ever feel the need to write a memoir, because if you do, then usually the memoirs come out of some kind of pain and suffering, either your own or your intimates. It was a challenge to write. But in fact, I'm not going to be reading from that book tonight because I'm still processing that book emotionally. But I will tell you a little story about that book because it relates to what I'm going to read here, which is that it's called A Man of Two Faces. And if any of you have actually read The Sympathizer, and if you haven't read The Sympathizer, don't worry, there will be an HBO TV series, which means you never have to read The Sympathizer. You just watch it on TV. But the opening line of The Sympathizer is, I'm a spy, a sleeper, a spook, a man of two faces. And the book is not autobiographical. None of the things that happen in the book have happened to me, except for the fall of Saigon. I was there for the fall of Saigon, but I was 4 years old, so I don't know if it counts because I don't remember anything about it. But the book is autobiographical in the sense that growing up in the United States as a refugee and as a Vietnamese person, I did feel like a man of two faces. I felt like in my parents' Vietnamese household, I felt like I was an American spying on these Vietnamese people. And outside of my parents' household, I felt like a Vietnamese person spying on Americans. So I took that feeling of being a man of two faces and two minds, and I took that and I put it into the character of a spy whose life was much more interesting than mine. So when it came time to write the memoir, I decided that the only way I could do it was to write my memoir as if I were the sympathizer writing about me in order to gain distance from myself and what I was going to describe in that book, which is the travails of being a refugee, of having a mother suffering from mental illness, of watching, of witnessing a country, the United States, which I had very ambivalent feelings about. That it is a country that is a country of democracy and freedom and opportunity, all true, also a country of genocide, enslavement, colonization, and war, all true. So the country itself is a country of two faces. Now I'm a man of two faces, and that's the dilemma that I was writing from. So I'm going to read actually an excerpt from The Sympathizer, from The Man of Two Faces, and it's about his arrival in a refugee camp in California in 1975, which is an experience that I shared, because when my family came to the United States, we were refugees in 1975. We ended up in a refugee camp or at a military base called Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania, which is its own complicated history, because for most of my life, I never asked myself, why is this fort called Indiantown Gap? I think it's kind of obvious why it was called Indiantown Gap, but the power of American mythology is such that I never thought twice about the fact that I, a refugee from an American war in which American soldiers were calling Vietnamese people Indians or natives, was now arriving in the United States and being put into a refugee camp in a fort that was built to fight Indians. Right? That's part of the complicated history that A Man of Two Faces, the memoir, deals with. But I'm reading this excerpt from the refugee camp that's in the more glamorous Camp Pendleton of San Diego because, in fact, today in this world, we have 30 million refugees going through circumstances very similar to this one, if they're lucky. If you're lucky as a refugee, you end up in a refugee camp that's in a country that will take you in. If you're unlucky, then you end up dead, or you end up in a refugee camp with no exit. So this is an excerpt from what life was like in the refugee camp for the Vietnamese who arrived in 1975. And he's writing a letter to his aunt in Paris describing this refugee camp. If allowed to stay together, I told my aunt, we could have incorporated ourselves into a respectably sized, self-sufficient colony, a pimple on the buttocks of the American body politic, sufficiently collective to elect our own representative to the Congress and have a voice in our America. A little Saigon, as delightful, delirious, and dysfunctional as the original, which was exactly why we were not allowed to stay together, but were instead dispersed by bureaucratic fiat. Wherever we found ourselves, we found each other. We did our best to conjure up the culinary staples of our culture. But since we were dependent on Chinese markets, our food had an unacceptably Chinese tinge. Another blow in the gauntlet of our humiliation that left us with the sweet and sour taste of unreliable memories. Just correct enough to evoke the past, just wrong enough to remind us that the past was forever gone, missing, along with the proper variety, subtlety, and complexity of our universal solvent, fish sauce. Oh, fish sauce, how we missed it, how nothing tasted right without it. This pungent liquid condiment of the darkest sepia hue was much denigrated by foreigners for its supposedly horrendous reek, lending new meaning to the phrase, there's something fishy around here, for we were the fishy ones. We used fish sauce the way Transylvanian villagers wore cloves of garlic to ward off vampires. In our case, to establish a perimeter with those Westerners who could never understand that what was truly fishy was the nauseating stench of cheese. What was fermented fish compared to curdled milk? But out of deference to our hosts, we kept our feelings to ourselves, sitting close to one another on prickly sofas and scratchy carpets, our knees touching under crowded kitchen tables, chewing on dried squid and the cud of remembrance until our jaws ached, trading stories heard second and third hand about our scattered countrymen. This was the way we learned of the Klan turned into slave labor by a farmer in Modesto, and the naive girl who flew to Spokane to marry her GI sweetheart and was sold to a brothel, and the widower with 9 children who went out into a Minnesotan winter and lay down in the snow with his back with mouth open until he was buried and frozen, and the regretful refugees on Guam who petitioned to go to Vietnam, never to be heard from again, and the devout Buddhist who spanked his young son and was arrested for child abuse in Houston, and the husband who slapped his wife and was jailed for domestic violence in Raleigh, and the men who had escaped but left wives behind in the chaos, and the women who had escaped but left husbands behind, and the children who had escaped without parents and grandparents, and the families missing 1, 2, 3, or more children. Sifting through the dirt, we pan for gold, the story of the baby orphan adopted by a Kansas billionaire, or the mechanic who bought a lottery ticket in Arlington and became a multimillionaire, or the girl elected president of her high school class in Baton Rouge, or the boy accepted by Harvard from Fond du Lac, or the movie star you love so much, dear aunt, who circled the world from airport to airport, no country letting her in after the fall of Saigon, none of her American movie star friends returning her desperate phone calls until, with her last dime, she snagged Tippi Hedren, who flew her to Hollywood. So it was that we soaped ourselves in sadness and we rinsed ourselves with hope. And for all that we believed almost every rumor we heard, almost all of us refused to believe that our nation was dead.
And now that Viet already answered all the questions that I have here to put him, I'm going to introduce him very briefly. He's a professor at Southern University in Los Angeles, and is a writer. I have here an idea that came from his work. The refugee or immigrant is someone with a shadow with the world and circumstances he came from. This experience of displacement runs through the work of Viet Thanh Nguyen. He was born in Vietnam in 1971 and went to the United States in 1975 as a refugee from one of the most violent wars in recent history. The Sympathizer, a novel he published in 2016, brings these ghosts to literature packed with a good dose of black humor in a thriller. It won the Pulitzer Prize a year after, in 2017. And in the meantime, he published the short story volume Refugees, and finally The Confidant, a kind of younger brother of The Sympathizer. All these 3 books are published in Portugal under the Elsinore imprint. This conversation comes just before the release in the United States of a memoir entitled A Man of the Faces. He already presented the book here. The book still hasn't been published here in Portugal, but will come soon. The publisher here already promises that. And meanwhile, Viet Thanh Nguyen lives in Pasadena, Los Angeles, and became a celebrated writer all over the world, a thinker of urgent topics such as migration, refugees, war trauma, colonialism, and racial segregation. It is a pleasure, again, to have you here. I was growing as a refugee in U.S.
How was growing up as a refugee in the U.S.? Wow, okay. Well, I mean, I think the first thing is
simple question to
simple
start.
question. Thank you, Isabel. Well, I think the first thing is that the United States thinks of itself as a country of immigrants. And so it understands everything through that language and that lens of immigration. So that even people who come to the United States as refugees know very quickly that they should call themselves immigrants instead. Because when you say you're a refugee in the United States, people are very confused. It's also the quickest way to kill a cocktail party conversation. Because we're like, oh, well, when you say refugee, all kinds of terrible images come into people's minds, right? And Americans are very resistant to the idea of refugees. So, for example, I came in 1975, and some of my fellow Vietnamese refugees ended up in Louisiana. And Hurricane Katrina happened 30 years later and displaced tens of thousands of people. And some in the US media called them refugees. And President George Bush said it's un-American to call these people refugees, right? Because it's just not possible in the American imagination for Americans to be refugees. So a lot of refugees end up calling themselves immigrants. And I didn't think anything of it myself until I started writing. And then I started to think about my history and why I came to be in the United States. And I did not come to be in the United States because I was an immigrant. Mm-hmm. My family did not choose to come to the United States. We just sort of ended up there accidentally. because there was a war fought in Vietnam. And so, when I think of myself in that way, it places me in a very contradictory or ambivalent situation relative to the United States, because most Americans want the refugee or the immigrant to say, thank you for letting me into the United States, the greatest country on earth. That's our function. Our function is to prove the greatness of the United States. My books, in The Sympathizer, there's a line where our narrator goes, well, we're thankful for being rescued by the United States, but maybe we wouldn't need to be thankful if we hadn't been, maybe we wouldn't have needed to be rescued if we hadn't been invaded by the United States in the first place. Most Americans don't want to hear this, but that's the kind of thing that I say in my books and in my work. So growing up in the United States as a refugee was very difficult, because anytime that history gets brought up as a refugee coming from the war in Vietnam, immediately Americans think of the war. Americans think of terrible images, which many of you have seen. And the only way that Americans can make sense out of that idea is to continue to think of Vietnam as a war that was fought somewhere else, but a war that mostly involved Americans. It's a real contradiction. Vietnam is a war, but when we think about Vietnam, we're only going to think about Americans. And this image that the Americans had, it's powerful because American popular culture dominates the world. And so the fantasies that Americans came up with in Hollywood about the war in Vietnam became exported all over the world. And that means that, number one, when I was growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, when I thought about Vietnam, I thought about the American war, because that's what I saw. And even now, when I go all over the world, most people know about Vietnam through American movies about the Vietnam War. So Vietnam won the war in fact, but lost the war in memory. I think it's the only war in history where the losers got to write the history for the world about this war. So, growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, I didn't understand any of this, but I was absorbing it. I was absorbing, these American attitudes, these American beliefs, these American mythologies, these American fantasies, and I was being, I think, damaged by them, by these stories that Americans were telling about their place in the world. But I wouldn't really understand until I was in college what these stories were, and once I did understand, I became very angry. And I thought, I'm going to become a writer, and I'm going to take revenge on Hollywood for what Hollywood has done.
To rescue the memory?
Yeah, the crimes that Hollywood has committed on the Vietnamese people. That's where The Sympathizer comes from.
You mentioned memory, and you mentioned the role your role as an observer, and I would like you to put here another subject. There is growing as an immigrant or as a refugee is growing also in translation, in permanent translation. I would like you to talk a little bit about that. The role your experience of a translator of the world that you are seeing for the first time, and the world where you came from and your parents came from, and you have to translate the world that you understand for them, I guess, and that role as an observer, but also as a spy. Going back to the first line of the Sympathizer.
Well, I think one reason why you see spies appear a lot in literature is that for certain writers, I think we understand that writers are also spies. Because when you talk to a writer, you should be very, very careful what you say. Because I think most writers are when they talk, at least when I talk to someone, I'm always observing. I'm always observing how people talk, what they say, what they wear, and I'm filing away all these notes in my mind for future reference.
Scary.
I have very rarely written. I've very rarely taken a whole human being and put them into my books, but I will take different parts of different people and put them together. And that comes about from spying, from constantly observing what people are doing. And so, most of the time, in The Sympathizer, for example, and in The Committed, our narrator says, he's very good at smiling. He's very good at listening and getting people to talk, because that's what a spy and a writer should be doing. Except for moments like this, I rarely talk. If I didn't talk, I'd be very awkward right now. But in most conversations, I'm sitting listening to people, trying to get them to speak to me so that I can observe and steal from them their secrets. So that's what writers do. But for me, very specifically, as someone who's a refugee, I think I already mentioned that I felt like a spy on my parents,
Yes.
and I felt like a spy on Americans. But I also felt that being born in Vietnam was a happy accident for me, because I came to the United States when I was 4 years old, and I don't have any memories of Vietnam. And I was fluent in Vietnamese when I came to the United States at the age of 4, and many decades later, I'm still fluent in Vietnamese at the age of 4. And it means that I'm still tied to Vietnam psychically and culturally because of those 4 years. But yet I'm still very much American because of how I was raised and how I spent almost my entire life in the United States. But because of that connection to Vietnam, I feel myself to be constantly inside and outside of any place where I am.
A sense of displacement?
Yeah, it's a sense of perpetual displacement, which is a very uncomfortable feeling. And I think most people reasonably do not want to feel uncomfortable. And so that's why a lot of people, if they're refugees or immigrants, they want to become fully a part of the country that they arrive in. In my case, I think I've tried to cultivate the feeling of displacement, of always being inside and outside, because it's a wonderful place to be a writer, to feel uncomfortable. If I was comfortable, I don't think I could be a writer. So the inside and outside relationship extends to language as well. So when I wrote The Sympathizer and all my other books, I'm fully fluent in English, but because of the fact that I have some relationship to Vietnamese, I can also see English from the outside as well. And that was very, very, powerful for me as a writer to be able to look at English from the inside and the outside.
You can do that?
I think so, yeah. But it's something that I think writers also have to cultivate as well. So, it took me 30 years of effort to become a writer. And I think I'm still becoming a writer. But even though I could see in order for me to see the language from the inside and the outside, I had to work at it for 30 years to build that ability.
And you have an history with a professor that told you that you were the best student, the worst student.
The worst student, yes.
How did you survive to that?
Well, I went to college, and I wanted to be a writer. And I had all these fantasies about being a writer. So I went to college at UC Berkeley, and I took a class with a writer named Maxine Hong Kingston, who wrote The Woman Warrior and Chinamen. And in 1990, when I took that class, The Woman Warrior was reputed to be the most widely taught book on college campuses in the United States. So she was a very famous writer. And I was 19 years old, so what did I care? So every day I would go into class of 14 students. I would sit this far away from Professor Kingston, and every day I would fall asleep. So at the end of the semester, she wrote me a letter. She wrote everybody a letter. But in my letter, she said, "You seem very alienated. You should make use of our excellent psychiatric services here at the university." I never did that. I became a writer instead. But yes, later she would tell me I was the worst student in her class. But what was happening to me at the time was that I wrote an essay for Maxine Hong Kingston about, and it was a nonfiction class. This was a memoir. I wrote an essay about my mother going to the mental hospital the year before. So I was 19. My mother went to the mental hospital when I was 18. And then I put that essay away, and I didn't look at it for 30 years because it was so difficult for me to write that essay, and then so difficult for me to think about what had happened to my mother. And so the moment I left Kingston's class, and I thought back, I never forgot that my mother went to the mental hospital, but I thought that she went to the mental hospital when I was a little boy because that's what it made me feel like, so frightened, so vulnerable. And then my editor asked me to write a nonfiction book. So I said, okay, I'll do this. And I went back and I found the essay and I read it again. And I thought, this is a terrible essay. No wonder why I was the worst student in Maxine's class. But I did write down some of the facts. And the facts were my mother went to the mental hospital when I was in college, not when I was a little boy. I recorded all these things, the details of the hospital, what my mother looked like, what she said, what I did, how I cried, and I had forgotten everything. And so I wrote the memoir. And
This memoir,
A Man of Two Faces. And so the memoir works itself up to that moment when I could finally find that essay and reconstruct what had happened to my mother, which is inseparable from everything I've told you. Because one of the questions that I ask in this memoir is, was my mother mentally ill? And she was a wonderful woman. Okay, she was a wonderful woman. She was born poor. She had very little education. She was a refugee twice. And she became a wealthy woman in Vietnam by sheer hard work and self-motivation. She lost everything, came to the United States, did it all over again. And then she went to the mental hospital. Wonderful woman. So my question in writing the memoir is, why was she ill? Was she ill just because of some mystery inside of her body and her mind? Or was she ill because of everything that she also endured as a refugee and through wars and through colonization, through famine, all these terrible things that happened to her? So I don't even know what question you asked. Okay, the question was, I was the worst student in Maxine's class. So yes, it took me 30 years to confront myself as that writer, that young writer in her class. I was the worst student. I didn't give up. I kept writing. And then I was able, finally, to approach what was the most difficult moment in my life, what happened to my family and to my mother.
Mm-hmm. And then years after you wrote The Sympathizer was a huge success, a critical success also. You won very important prizes. And then you came with this second book, The Refugees. There is a volume of short stories. And then this third, there is a kind of new brother of this. And there is a geographic triangle here also, because if you have before the United States and Vietnam, with the Compromiser we have France also. So how do you connect these two books? Because The Sympathizer and The Committed, they are connected.
So I was born in Vietnam, and at a very, I guess, interesting moment in history, which is the end of the American war in Vietnam, but also at a moment when the Vietnamese people still remembered the French who were in Vietnam at the same time. And this is a very interesting moment because these are three countries, France, the United States, and Vietnam, who are born out of revolutions for independence.
Yes.
And great ideals. The French, great country, loved France. But then, of course, France had to ruin everything by going to colonize other countries. The United States, great country, democracy, freedom, independence. And then we had to ruin it by going to invade a bunch of other countries. Vietnam, great, we won, we defeated these two great powers. And then the Vietnamese also did some terrible things to each other after that. Mm-hmm. So I'm deeply interested by this idea that, great revolutions can ruin themselves or compromise themselves through their own failures and their own contradictions and their own absurdities and their own hypocrisies. And my parents suffered for that. My parents lived through these histories. My parents were born in the 1930s. They left Vietnam in 1975, which means they saw 40 years of famine, colonization, war, refugee experience, all these terrible things. I get to be the inheritor of these histories. My parents were never going to write about these things. They suffered for them, but I could write about them. And so that's what connects these books, is my attempt to both talk about the very personal stories of my parents, my relatives, my family, who were personal witnesses to this history, and then also to connect it to the actual politics of these revolutions, which I think concern all of us, because in fact, the American and the French revolutions have certainly shaped the world that we live in. And the Vietnamese Revolution, for a while at least, inspired some part of the world.
Mm-hmm. And all of this is very serious, very, very strong and emotionally strong. But there is a big sense of humor here. How do you deal with this? It was a tool to deal with all this tragedy and absurdity of war, the irony and the humor.
I think the books are very funny, actually. Not everybody agrees, but I think the books are very funny. And so...
It seems strange, but it's true.
Well, I'll give you an example of one joke in the book that's very divisive. And this will be a test for all of you, But when I was growing up, I read this book called Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth. He's a very famous American novelist. I don't know how many of you read it. It was a huge bestseller in the 1960s, and then I read it as a boy in San Jose, California, when I was about 12 or 13 years old in the early 1980s. and it's about a young Jewish American named Alex Portnoy. And I felt a certain affiliation with Jewish Americans because here is a population fleeing from a terrible tragedy. The shadow of history hangs over them. But the second generation of Alex Portnoy, he just wants to be an American.
Yes.
You know, and he's a very horny adolescent. And he's so horny, he can't keep his hands off anything. And so the only thing that I remember from Portnoy's complaint is the fact that young Alex Portnoy will masturbate with anything. Most famously, he discovers in his family's refrigerator a slab of liver, and he masturbates with that. And then he puts it back into the refrigerator, and then later that night, his family eats the liver for dinner. And I thought, gross. Who eats liver for dinner? Well, in fact, growing up as a Vietnamese refugee, we ate liver for dinner. No one else I knew ate liver for dinner, you know. So I remember that. And so when I wrote The Sympathizer,
it could happen with us in Portugal. We eat
do we eat liver? Then good. Now you will never be able to eat liver again without thinking of this scene. I think it's very funny, right? So I was writing The Sympathizer, and you know, part of the book is planned, much of the book is unplanned. And one day I finish my writing for the day, and then I have to cook that night. And then on the menu is squid. I've never cooked squid before. I think this is a part of Portuguese cuisine, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I never cooked
Also,
squid before.
we eat everything.
Yeah, you eat everything, but then you're like the Vietnamese. So I did not realize when you cook squid that you have to clean the squid. So I was following the recipe, I cleaned the squid, and I put my fingers inside the squid, and I thought, wow, this is interesting. It reminds me of something. And I thought, I have to put this in my novel. So the next day, I write a scene in the novel where my young narrator, who's 12 or so, his father, who's a French priest, also a big no-no, delivers squid to his mother, who's too poor to afford this food. And so his mother has the squid. And she's about to make it for dinner, but she leaves the house, and our young narrator is so horny that he masturbates with the squid. And then he puts it away, and his mother comes back, and she makes the squid for dinner. And it's only the two of them, and he's horrified. So he has to make sure he eats the squid that he has violated so that his mother doesn't eat it. So some of you are laughing. Good. Okay, that's very typical of the humor in The Sympathizer. So there's a certain number of readers who refuse to read my novel after that point. Like, this is gross, this is disgusting, this is horrible. But the next line, right after he eats the squid, is that he says, I wish masturbation made us mumble as much as massacres do. And so the point is, like, you know, people are perfectly willing to talk about murders and massacres and so on, but masturbation with a squid, that's too much. We can't do that. You know, so it's literally a test for all of you. You know, what are you willing to read? What are you willing to talk about? But you have to get past the masturbation first to get to that line.
It's a test.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of jokes like that in the novel. And the reason why is because I think humor is very important. You know, we're talking about all these terrible things like war and revolution and massacre and all that. And they're terrible, right? But they're also born out of incredible hypocrisy and absurdities and contradictions. People don't go to murder other people when it comes to warfare nowadays and say, well, we just want to kill you because we want to take your country. You know, now we say, we're going to liberate your country. And if we kill some of you in the process, it's for your own good. That's funny. I mean, it's terrible, but it's also funny, right? And so if you can find the humor in that, that's where some great satirical and anti-war literature comes from. So in the American tradition, we have Catch-22. In France, we have Journey to the End of the Night by Louis Ferdinand Céline. In Portuguese, you have Antonio Lobo Antunes and his writings, which were important for me. So I put my literature, my writing in that kind of tradition.
How did you discover Lobo Antunes?
Lobo Antunes. I was writing The Sympathizer, and I was reading books that I thought would be important for me. So I reread Catch-22, I read Journey to the End of the Night, and then I read a review in the newspaper of this new translation of this novel from a novelist I'd never heard of before, Antonio Lobo Antunes. And the review said this is a very funny novel and dark novel about the Portuguese colonization of Angola and the war there.
Judas. I don't know how is the translation in English.
It's The Asshole of Judas,
Yes.
which is a great title. But of course, Americans can't deal with that. So in the new American translation, it's The Land at the End of the World, which is very poetic, very poetic. But The Asshole of Judas is much more accurate to Lobo Antunes. And so, but I thought, and the review described this as Angola's Vietnam. So I thought, okay, I got to go read this novel. And I went and I read the novel right away, and I was immediately captured by the novel. Not only because of the
the humor, you mentioned the humor.
Yes, it was not only because of the content of the Portuguese, of the war and everything, but because of the voice of Lobo Antunes. And the fact that it was dark and satirical and funny and soaked in alcohol and misogyny, all these kinds of things, because that is actually very much what The Sympathizer is about. And so it was a perfect coincidence that this novel, it arrived to me at the moment I was writing The Sympathizer. Very inspirational for me.
The confidence starts with an image that I would like to bring to our conversation. That is the image of the refugees in the boats going away, running away from Vietnam. That image is a metaphor of literature. I'm thinking of Odyssey or something like that. But it's also a metaphor for what's happening nowadays. It's a political metaphor also. How do you combine these two ideas dealing with this image of a boat in a sea?
So I think most of you probably remember that many Vietnamese refugees took to boats in the late 1970s to flee from Vietnam.
It was the way that you...
No, we left by boat, but in 1975.
Yes.
And so we were not the boat people. So in the late 1970s, then the Western media invents the term boat people to describe all these people. So we were before the boat people. And I found this term very demeaning. Now, the term was very powerful, the boat people, because what it did was it brought the experience of the Vietnamese refugees to global awareness. And what that meant is that a lot of these Vietnamese refugees could then eventually be resettled. So it was a very important word in helping to save Vietnamese refugees. But it was also a term like the Vietnam War that would fix Vietnamese people in the global consciousness as victims. First, Vietnam were victims of war. Then boat people were victims of this experience. Victims, victims, victims. And when I went to France, and I was there to do research for the novel, I discovered that the French, who don't like to take English words and bring them into their language, you know what the French call boat people? Les boat people. So that term is so powerful that the French just took it. And I thought, well, this is a term that is accurate and inaccurate at the same time, because yes, all these people fled by boats, but the term boat people demeans them by turning them into victims. Now, in fact, most of the people who fled Vietnam by boat knew perfectly well that there was a very good chance they were going to die. And in fact, I think the UNHCR, the UN Agency on Refugees, estimates that something like half of the people who fled Vietnam died by boat. So, astronauts who go into outer space, they could die, and some of them have, but most of them come back. We call astronauts heroes. We call boat people boat people. It doesn't make any sense to me. Because if you knew that if you got on a boat and your chances of survival were 50%, I think that's heroic. But the difference is that we don't get to tell our own stories. Other people tell our stories. So we become boat people, we become victims instead of heroes. But you know who else were boat people? Christopher Columbus, I think, was a boat person. He got on this little tiny boat, went across the ocean. Who else was boat people? The Pilgrims. The Pilgrims got on these little boats, they went across the ocean. They show up in what we now call America, and they were just lucky that indigenous peoples didn't have cameras to take pictures of them coming off their boats, because they probably looked terrible. Months and months on boats, they didn't shave, they smelled terribly, they were desperate. They needed the help of indigenous peoples to survive. They were boat people. But they conquered the country, and then they got to tell their own stories. And so now we remember Pilgrims not as boat people and not as refugees, but as the heroic founders of the United States. So stories are very important. And so in writing the opening of The Committed, I set the people on the boat to evoke a real history of so-called boat people, but to also ensure that we see them as living an epic. Because you know who else was a boat person? Ulysses. He was a boat person. He was on a boat. But we remember Ulysses as his story as an odyssey, a founding epic of the European canon, right? And so I wanted to cast these refugees in the same kinds of epic and heroic terms, while also acknowledging that these people on this boat were also very desperate as well.
Mm-hmm. I don't resist to read the first lines of the committed. Just to, it's in Portuguese. I'm sorry, but just to illustrate what we are talking about. It's on a prologue. Éramos os indesejados, os dispensáveis, os invisíveis, aqueles que ninguém via, exceto nós mesmos. Valíamos menos do que nada e era nada o que víamos, agachados às cegas no escuro ventre da nossa arca, 150 a transpirar num espaço não concebido para nós, mamíferos, mas para os peixes do mar. As ondas sacudiam-nos de um lado para o outro e nós dizíamos coisas nas nossas línguas maternas. Em alguns casos eram orações, noutros invectivas. Quando o movimento das ondas mudou e a nossa embarcação foi impelida mais vigorosamente, um dos poucos marinheiros que havia no nosso grupo murmurou: chegámos ao oceano. Depois de horas aos zigue-zagues pelo rio, depois pelo estuário, depois pelo canal, eis que deixávamos a nossa terra-mãe. Começa assim o livro. This is the beginning of the book. I would like you now to make this connection between literature and history, because I guess all your books have this, and your memory, that your memoir that will come soon, also deals with that. Literature or memoir / history. What is important here?
For me, I think one of the things that's important is how much we deceive ourselves through our memory and through our history. I mean, for me, it's obviously very personal. I told you that story about my mother in the mental hospital and how I deceived myself. I mean, I literally was there to watch this experience happen, and yet I was capable of changing my own memory in a very, very fundamental way to protect myself. Right? And so much of my work deals with people who deceive themselves through memory, either deliberately or accidentally. But I also think countries, we use memory and history to deliberately shape the stories we want to tell ourselves about our countries, our nations, in order to make us feel better. Because most nations, most countries don't want to tell stories about their history where they say, well, we arrived here, there was another people living here, we killed them all, and then we took it over, and that's how our country came into being. We don't want to say that. So we say, we came here, and there was nobody living here, and we built this glorious country. The greatest country on earth is what Americans like to say. That's a deception that then becomes our history. So what nations and collectives and communities do is not that different, I think, than what humans and individuals do in order to present a better version of ourselves to each other. And so I think that's what my novels and my stories deal with, these mutual layers of self-narration and self-deception in order to help ourselves survive. And out of that comes great drama and great tragedy, and also hopefully some humor as well.
Mm-hmm. And you are a writer, a fictional writer, but you are also an essayist, a professor, and a kind of activist, I guess, with questions like colonialism, ethnicity, migration, all of this that we are talking. How do you confront yourself with these two identities, also two faces? Because as a fictional writer, as a man who makes literature, you are not an activist, but as an essayist and as a citizen, you are. Tell me about this ambivalence or if there is no ambivalence.
I don't think there's much ambivalence. I think that there's a whole tradition of writers who are committed writers, and that's
Yes.
partly what the title of the English
Yes,
title
committed.
of the second novel, The Committed, refers to. And when I became okay, so I will tell you a little story. The first time I wanted to be a writer was when I was 8 years old. I was in school, and we all had to write our own books and draw our own books. And so I wrote and drew a book when I was 8 years old called Lester the Cat. It had nothing to do with politics, nothing to do with history. It had to do with Lester the cat, who was bored with city life, and then who fled to the countryside and fell in love with a country cat. The end. And so it was a romance, and about urban alienation. And I just wanted to tell stories, all right? But then I went to college at UC Berkeley, and I became a different kind of writer. I became a writer who wanted to be a committed writer in the tradition of many European writers, for example.
For instance,
Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Frantz Fanon. We're talking about the global black diaspora of writers. Many of them, the ones that I admired, were committed writers. Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire. And then within the United States, many of the writers I admired. Du Bois as well. He pronounced his name the American way.
Yeah.
Many of the American writers that I admired were not only black writers, but also refugee writers, immigrant writers, writers of color, feminist writers, who were all committed writers. And so that's the tradition that I locate myself in. And so there's no contradiction.
Mm-hmm.
And the writers that I really like, people, if we think about writers like Fanon, or if we think about another writer that I admire, like the German writer W.G. Sebald, when they write, they don't draw a distinction between different genres of writing. Mm-hmm. So sometimes they'll write journalism, sometimes they'll write academic essays, sometimes they'll write fiction, and so on. And so what matters most is the act of writing. And I think that eliminates all contradiction, because then the primary commitment is to writing as a mode of carrying out one's belief about truth or justice or beauty. And so I told you the story about that little 8-year-old boy writing that book about Lester the cat, because that's also me. That was also my commitment to beauty at 8 years of age, And so I think for me to be committed to beauty and great art is also to be committed to truth and justice. And so these books, they're very much about politics and history and so on, but they're also books about the power and beauty of writing as well. And so I do believe that you could write about terrible things and write about them in the most beautiful way possible as well. And so I return to Du Bois, or to Fanon, or to Camus, or to Sartre, or to Toni Morrison, because they write about very serious things, and they write about them in the most beautiful way possible.
Mm-hmm. When you mentioned you mentioned before that idea of history, and I was thinking about the history of United States also. The history of United States, it's an history of colonization, as you said, of migration. You consider yourself an American. You're born in Vietnam, and you are a writer, an American writer. But it's difficult for you to say that, or you have to always, as you need always to justify that what you are making is literature and is American literature because you live in that territory, because you have that experience of being an American, besides being also a Vietnamese.
Mm. Well, I think my dilemma is not unusual. So, for example, if when someone who is an American writer writes a book in the United States, they're automatically considered American writers. And
Philip Roth wanted to be considered an American writer.
And he became an American writer. He started off as a Jewish American writer, then he became an American writer and a writer, right?
Yes.
Whether that Jewish American experience, which is also true for Saul Bellow as well and other Jewish American writers, whether that experience is possible for someone like me is a completely different question. Because Philip Roth could write about Jewish American people in New Jersey, for example, and that is now treated as American literature. I write about the Vietnam War, and that's treated as, by some readers, as Vietnamese American literature. I think of it as American literature. So there's still that challenge, that dilemma for someone like me. And in the memoir that I just wrote, A Man of Two Faces, I'm very explicit about saying that for writers who are classified as a so-called racial minority, we're treated as if we only write about our racial minority experiences. Whereas I think many of us would say, no, we're writing about the United States. If you acknowledge that the United States is composed of refugees and immigrants and people of color and black people and the enslaved and indigenous peoples, all of that is American culture and American history. So, but we have to say that explicitly. I'll give you another example. Oftentimes I'm introduced in the United States as Viet Thanh Nguyen, the Vietnamese American writer. I actually do not have a problem with that. However, if I'm sitting next to Jonathan Franzen, and someone says, here is Viet Thanh Nguyen, the Vietnamese American writer, and here's Jonathan Franzen, the writer, I do find that offensive. I do, because it's either adjectives for everybody or adjectives for nobody. But if it's only adjectives for somebody or some people, then we know that there is an act of marginalization happening. So in my memoir, A Man of Two Faces, I make it a point to say, the great white male American novelist, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Because he is. He is. But I'm perfectly happy to call F. Scott Fitzgerald a novelist if I'm introduced as a novelist too.
Just to finish before passing to the audience, Donald Trump, I'm sorry to mention, Donald Trump, he was elected in 2016 with an argument, the refugees were a big argument in his speech to be elected. It passed, I don't know, 6 years, 7 years now. You feel that this continues to be an argument to win elections, the refugees?
Of course. It's happening today, right now, with the continuing discussion about how the United States will control or not control immigration and refugees at its borders. So I think one thing I want to say is that this is not only about Donald Trump. I mean, whether we talk about Democrats or Republican presidents, they both have certain kinds of attitudes about the border, about immigration, about refugees, and about war that's bipartisan. So, for example, Democratic presidents have no problem killing other people using drone strikes. That's not a Republican-only issue. Democratic presidents have no problem building cages to put people in. Obama built the first cages, and then Trump put a lot of people into them. So there's a very bipartisan continuity around questions of borders, immigration, warfare, and about this idea that America is the greatest country on earth. There's no disagreement about that between Democrats and Republicans. I have a lot of disagreements about that. However, I will say that Donald Trump did make it extremely personal. And he turned the questions of the refugees and immigrants and the border into a political spectacle. He turned it into entertainment in order to motivate his political base. That makes it very personal for me. So in my memoir, A Man of Two Faces, I do say President Barack Obama is a man of two faces too. Because Barack Obama was elected with all kinds of hopes and dreams of the American people, and then he went and he killed a lot of people with drone strikes. That's completely American. However, Donald Trump belongs at a slightly different level of personal animosity towards refugees, which Barack Obama didn't necessarily have. And so in the memoir, Donald Trump, every time I mention him, I censor his name. I redact it. Because I do take his name personally. Because I think he takes people like me personally. And then he's willing to turn refugees and immigrants into scapegoats for his kind of politics. And if he gets, when he runs for president, as apparently he will continue saying exactly the same things and probably worse. And if he becomes president, he will do exactly what he did before. And I want to say that, you know, this whole issue about refugees and immigrants and what the Trump administration did to people at the border, he put people into cages and he separated children from their families, and nobody in the Trump administration thought this was a problem. They had no human empathy for what they were going to do. So that later they would say, well, we're not responsible, as if they could not imagine what it would mean to separate children from families. And there are still 700 children who have never been reconnected with their families. Now, 700 children may be a very small number of people, but for each of those families and each of those children, that is a disaster. And I take it very personally because when I arrived in the United States at 4 years of age, I was separated from my parents and sent to live with a different family for a few months. And that was done for good, benevolent reasons, but I did not understand that when I was 4 years of age. So my first memories of ever was of myself screaming and howling as I was being taken away from my parents. And I never forgot that. And so these 700 children and the 4,000 families that were separated, they will never forget what has happened to them. And under the Trump administration, this was acceptable. And he just said, I will do it again if I'm reelected president. And I take him seriously. I think he will do it again. So it is very personal. And I do think, however, that President Biden is also doing some similar things at the border as well. So it puts Americans like me into a difficult situation. We have to be critical of both administrations, both parties, but I think I also recognize that a President Trump will take it to an even higher level of spectacle and cruelty, which is what worries me.
Now we open to...
You had to leave it on Donald Trump. Yes, okay. Well, let's not talk about him again for the rest of our conversation, if we could.
We can say the joke now.
No. There will be many other opportunities to talk about Donald Trump, I'm sure, in the future, but maybe not again today.
So you have been here 20 years ago?
2003, yeah.
Yes, 20 years ago. How do you find Lisbon? Different?
Oh, I love Lisbon. Lisbon's wonderful. No, seriously, I came to Lisbon in 2003. My parents were visiting me on my honeymoon in Paris, and my parents' idea of a great European vacation was to visit the Catholic shrines of Europe. So I, being the good son, took them to Lourdes in southern France and then Fatima here in Portugal. You laugh. I was like, oh my God, I have to go to Fatima. But I persuaded my parents to go to Lisbon first. And I loved it. I thought I thought the Portuguese are kind of similar to the Vietnamese. You know, they were kind of laid back, we're Catholic, and we like to eat, drink, and have a good time. And I always wanted to come back. But I did have to go to Fatima and see it, and that's a spectacle as well. I don't know how many of you have had a chance, but you should see it at least once. And that convinced me that, you know, Vietnamese Catholics and Portuguese Catholics share something very similar. We love to suffer, and we love to make sure people know that we love to suffer, and that is a part of my Catholic tradition.
But aren't you an atheist?
I am an atheist. I don't believe in God, but I believe in suffering. Okay. So that's what being a Catholic has left me with. It's very good for being a writer because you have to suffer to be a writer.
Yeah, that's sacrifice. So now we can pass the word to the audience. There's one question there.
Modern Vietnam is a very vibrant, interesting place. Have you ever thought about writing something about what's going on today instead of what went on 50 years ago?
Yeah.
Because after all, 50 years ago is a long time. I mean, most people here weren't born 50 years ago. I was by chance, but something modern might take more reading.
Well, in the Refugees, the short story collection, there are two stories set in Vietnam of the 2000s. So not exactly 2023, which is what you're talking about, but the early 2000s, when Vietnam was undergoing this transition from all the memories of the war and the past to being what it is today, which is basically a capitalist country. And so I think those two stories, one story is called The Americans, another story is called Fatherland, deal with things that are happening in contemporary Vietnam that I think are still very relevant. So just to give you a brief description, at least in Fatherland, it's based on a true story. I met a Vietnamese American woman, and she said she was a refugee, and she said, yeah, we fled to the United States, my mother and 3 of us, children, and we left our father behind. And the reason why was because he had another wife. And so we left him behind. And then he and this other woman had 3 more children, and he named them after us. And I thought, that's a great story. So I said, can I write about that? She said, okay, you can do it. And so I wrote that story, and in the story I have the eldest Vietnamese American daughter, go back to Vietnam and find her father and meet her siblings, including the eldest daughter there who is named after her. And so the two of them meet, and the story is told from the Vietnamese girl's perspective. And she looks up to her elder sister. She looks up to the United States. She has all these fantasies about life in America and how wonderful it must be to have been a Vietnamese American and to have all these possibilities, because her elder sister became a doctor in the United States. And now the elder sister has come back, her namesake, and she's come back with the American dream, which is what she wants, this younger sister. Well, as it turns out, the elder daughter is actually a receptionist who got fired from her job and has come back because with a few $1,000s, you can still live pretty well in Vietnam. And the younger sister says, please take me with you to the United States and make my dreams come true. And her elder sister finally has to confess, I can't do that because I'm not a doctor, I'm just a receptionist who's been fired. And that to me is a fable for contemporary Vietnam. Its hopes, its aspirations, what it wants, and what I think awaits it, and is true for so many of its people. They do want to become capitalists. They do want, maybe not necessarily the American dream, but they want everything that they think capitalism will bring to the country. But capitalism will bring you cars and pollution. It will also bring you hope and disillusionment too. So I think that story, for example, is about as contemporary as my work gets in Vietnam. Vietnam, if you visited, right? I have. Have you been to Vietnam? And yeah, if you go to Vietnam, and I have been back to Vietnam. 2002 to 2014, I went back many times. And I saw a country that was making this leap into global capitalism. And so if you visit now, some 9 years out later, you'll see skyscrapers, you'll see fancy cars. For example, I visited Hanoi. My cousin picked me up. Her husband drove the most expensive Mercedes you could ever possibly buy. However, in Vietnam, you can't drive that Mercedes faster than 40 miles an hour because the roads in Hanoi are not very good, or they're crowded. There's too many cars. And that to me was a very good metaphor for global capitalism in Vietnam. You can buy the most expensive car possible. People buy Lamborghinis. I have seen Lamborghinis on the streets of Vietnam, but the roads are so rutted, you can't drive them more than 40 miles an hour. That's a contradiction that encapsulates so many of Vietnam's hopes and aspirations and its realities for me. So go to Vietnam. It's a beautiful country. If you're into 5-star resorts, they have 5-star resorts. If you're into backpacking, you can go backpacking for very cheap. And then you will see for yourself all the beauties and all the contradictions of a country entering global capitalism.
Hello. Well, first of all, thank you for this beautiful and thought-provoking conversation. It was wonderful. I'm one of those people that got to know the Vietnam War through American movies, mostly, especially Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket or Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. So I wanted to ask you 2 questions. The first one is, Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket is considered by some film critics one of the greatest war movies ever made. I wanted to know your thoughts on this. And then I also wanted to ask you if you could recommend us some films that can show maybe the Vietnam War more from a Vietnamese perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. I could recommend some movies that will show the war from the Vietnamese perspective. The problem is, how will you find them? And again, this goes to the fact that memory is not equal.
Right.
I mean, in this room, all of our memories are equal. My memories are equal to your memories. However, I'm a writer and you're not. I don't know. Are you a writer? Before I say that,
I'm
okay.
not.
So then I publish books and you don't. So therefore, my memories will matter more because more people will read my books. Then we'll have access to your memories. Likewise, on the global stage, memories are not equal. So American memories count more than Vietnamese memories because American memories have global power behind them, and Vietnamese memories do not yet. So I could recommend to you the movies of Vietnam's most famous director, Dang Nhiet Minh, who made When the 10th Month Comes, which is, I think, one of the great Vietnamese movies about war and loss and memory. That was made in, I think it was made in 1982, right? Only 4 years after Apocalypse Now. But
What's the title again?
When the 10th Month Comes. It's a black and white movie. So 1978, Apocalypse Now comes out. It's made with the highest state of cinematic technology possible in the world. 1982, When the 10th Month Comes out, it's a beautiful poetic movie, but it's in black and white because that's what the Vietnamese had access to. Dang Nhiet Minh later would go make a movie called Don't Burn, which is based on a memoir of a North Vietnamese doctor who volunteers to go south and then is killed by American troops when she's 26 years old. And the American troops take her diary and they take it to the United States, and then it eventually comes back to Vietnam, is translated, becomes a big bestseller in Vietnam, and then Dang Nhiet Minh makes the film Don't Burn. You can't. I doubt that you will be able to find it, but good luck to you, right? But these are two movies you could look at. So that's part of the problem of the dilemma of your question, is that even if you wanted to watch Vietnamese movies, how could you find them? I think When the 10th Month Comes might be on YouTube. Okay. It is, with English subtitles, right?
Great.
But again, it's on YouTube. It's not in the movie theater, big screen, all of this kind of thing. It's not on the best lists. It's a list of the best movies ever made where Apocalypse Now and Full Metal Jacket are on. So in fact, in the memoir that's called A Man of Two Faces, which hopefully will be published in Portuguese so that you can read it for yourself, I spend quite a bit of time talking about American movies. And one of the things that I say is that I think Apocalypse Now and Full Metal Jacket are great works of art. I also think they're racist. I think it's possible to make great works of art that are racist at the same time. We have many examples of this. So Apocalypse Now is loosely based on Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, a great book. But Chinua Achebe thinks it's really racist. I think he's right. I think Heart of Darkness is a great novel, modernist masterpiece in which black people, Africans, have nothing meaningful to say in a drama about their own enslavement and what colonization does to Congolese, right? And Apocalypse Now does exactly the same thing. It is a condemnation of the American war in Vietnam and the American atrocities that are being committed, and it silences Vietnamese people. Full Metal Jacket, also a condemnation of the American military complex, and American machismo, and the American war mentality, and one in which the entire movie depends on the killing of a Vietnamese woman, and the rape and the sexuality and the prostitution of Vietnamese women. And I think that Stanley Kubrick is doing that very deliberately, but he's also completely silencing Vietnamese women at the same time. And I don't think that this is an accident. I think it is built into American culture and into Hollywood. And if people say to me, oh, Full Metal Jacket was 1989, I think. That was a long time ago. Well, in 2018, HBO made Watchmen, a TV series, which I love. It's a great TV series. Have you seen Watchmen?
I haven't.
It's a great anti-racist TV series in which a black woman becomes the hero against American white supremacists. However, also in this TV series is a Vietnamese woman, Lady Jiu, named after one of our great heroes in Vietnamese history. She is a trillionaire scientist who has great ambitions to remake the world according to her utopian ambitions. At the end of the movie, she's murdered by a barrage, get this, of frozen squid from outer space. Don't ask me to, it's very complicated, don't ask me to explain it, you have to watch it. And I watched it and I thought, this is kind of racist and kind of sexist that in an anti-racist drama about black and white relations in the United States, you have to go and kill the Vietnamese woman. In 2020, a gunman in the United States murders 8 people in Atlanta, 6 of whom are Asian women, right? That's not an accident. And so I was thinking, could HBO have made Watchmen in 2021 and kill a Vietnamese woman in the same way? I don't think so. So I think before the murder of 6 Asian women in Atlanta, people could watch Watchmen or Full Metal Jacket or Apocalypse Now and say, it's just a story. We don't think there's a real connection between killing Asian women on screen and killing Asian women in real life or Asian people. I do. And that's the point, one of the points that I make in the book, A Man of Two Faces. I do. I think that stories have the power to save us, and stories have the power to destroy us. And that's what I learned from watching America's movies about the Vietnam War. Because I don't think that these movies are harmless. I think they're enormously powerful. Have you seen Jarhead? The movie Jarhead?
No.
Okay, Jarhead is a movie starring Jamie Foxx and Jake Gyllenhaal that is based on a real memoir called Jarhead by Anthony Swofford. Anthony Swofford is my age. He watched these Vietnam War movies, and then he became an American Marine who went to fight in Iraq, or in Kuwait, in Operation Desert Storm. And in the memoir, he has a passage which is directly translated into the movie. You can watch this. And in the passage, Anthony Swofford says, we all grew up, these Marines, we all grew up watching American war movies about Vietnam. Full Metal Jacket, Apocalypse Now. And he says, average Americans and people the world over may watch these movies and think they're anti-war movies, but we, the Marines, know they are pro-war movies. Because watching these movies, these young American men got very excited. And Swofford says, I watched these movies about American soldiers going off to have sex with women, to kill, to rape, and I was excited. And now it's our turn, our generation, it's our turn to do drugs, rape women, and kill people. And then if you watch the movie Jarhead, the young Marines are in a theater watching Apocalypse Now, the famous scene where the helicopters attack the Vietnamese village, which is supposed to be an anti-war scene, I think, but the Marines are going crazy. They love it. They're like, this is exciting. This is what we're here to do. And so
Also
it's a very long answer to your question, but because I think, in fact, this is how we know that American culture is very powerful. Because it doesn't matter what the content is, but the fact is you, as a Portuguese person, are watching these movies and you are absorbing American culture. And that means that you've already been brainwashed by the United States.
I hope not.
A little bit of you has already been brainwashed
Probably.
by the United States.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming out to Lisbon. So on the topic of mythology formation and the war mentality in the US, I know that you are staying a bit private about the memoir, but I found it really interesting that you pointed out this meeting between the refugee experience and the legacy of settler colonialism with the fort that you stayed at. I think that's not touched as often as it should be, the kind of perpetual war that starts with the absolute beginning of the project that is the U.S., that leads into modern day wars. And I just wanted to ask if you could elaborate how this thread is taking form in your memoir that is also so intimately about family.
So I thank you for that question. In fact, I think that the power of American mythology, the American dream, the immigrant myth is so powerful that most Americans believe in it. Certainly immigrants and refugees who come to the United States believe in it. Right? And so we come to the United States with this idea that we are going to claim the country. We're going to make it ours by the American dream. You know, we will work hard, we will succeed in capitalism, we will get our share, and we'll make our claim. But even the very language of claiming America is very colonizing, right? But it's so powerful that most Americans will not say what you just said, which is settler colonialism, because most Americans do not think that they are colonizers, or that if colonization did happen, it happened a long time ago. If you ask indigenous peoples in the United States, I think many of them will say, in fact, colonization is still happening. That's what settler colonialism is. The settlers arrive and they never leave. But you're not allowed to think that way, or you're not encouraged to think that way in the United States. Certainly not if you're an immigrant or a refugee. So part of our function as immigrants and refugees, what I say in the memoir, is that we are the alibis for settler colonialism. Because our arrival and our incorporation, our welcoming into the United States, if it happens, is proof of the American dream at the expense of indigenous peoples. I think about the fact that, I own a home in the United States, but owning that home is only made possible by the history of settler colonialism. I tell two stories. For example, I mentioned the 6 Asian women who were murdered in Atlanta. One of them owned her own business, a massage parlor, in a shopping plaza. Do you know what that shopping plaza was called? Cherokee Village. There are no more Cherokee left in Atlanta where this happened. They were all driven out and relocated forcibly somewhere else. At least 4,000 Cherokee died when they were forced to leave Georgia. But this particular Chinese immigrant woman comes to the United States, realizes her American dream in Cherokee Village. We come to the United States as refugees. We are settled in Fort Indian Town Gap. And in researching the book, I read there's very little history about the indigenous peoples of that area. But what I did read is that they were called the Susquehannock or the Conestoga. By the 1700s or so, most of them have been eliminated for one reason or another. And the very last population are massacred in the early 1700s by a gang of white men who call themselves the Paxton Boys because they come from an area called Paxton Township. In writing the memoir, I discovered that when my parents bought their first home, they bought it in Paxton Township. That's our claim to America, that it's made possible by the eradication of indigenous peoples. How do we reconcile? We can't reconcile that reality. That's an irreconcilable reality of the United States that we are all encouraged to forget. I was encouraged to forget it, and I did forget it. I can't say I forgot it, I just didn't know about it. But what I was encouraged to do was never to ask questions about it, about that history. And so the memoir is very much about writing that history into existence and to say that, on the one hand, yes, I've realized the American dream, as much as anyone can realize the American dream. I'm a writer, I publish books, I win the Pulitzer Prize, and yet all of that is also made possible by this history of settler colonialism, which extends to the war in Vietnam that brought me to the United States. We have to talk about that history, and that's what I do in the memoir. But in the context of American literature, the mythology of the American dream, we're only supposed to talk about, hey, you won the Pulitzer Prize, welcome. You're proof of how great America is, that we can fight a war in Vietnam and then a Vietnamese-American writer can win the Pulitzer Prize. But I refuse to be talked about in those terms. But the only way to refuse to be talked about in those terms is to say very explicitly what I just said to you and then to write about it in the book.
Dr. Nguyen, thanks so much for this really revealing talk. It made me think quite a bit about the flip sides of make-believe, where on the one hand, a nation can come up with stories that become history, that become legend. But fiction, on the other hand, has no qualms about saying that is unreal. As you move between genres now, academic work, writing fiction, and now writing memoir, how do you grapple with this issue of making believe where truth is revealed through making believe?
We met, right? So I was like, I gotta recognize you. Okay, thank you for your question. Well, I'm sorry. Truth is made possible by making believe. Right. Who was I just reading? We tell lies. I mean, the common idea about fiction, for example, is that we tell lies, we make up stories in order to access some kind of a truth, right? And I think there is a lot of power to that, because I think most people would not want to listen to someone like me say what I just said in the form of an academic lecture or a speech of some kind. But in writing novels, a novel like The Sympathizer or The Committed, hopefully entertaining stories, there is power to that in getting people to sit there and read the story and be entertained, and then to absorb some of those things that I've just mentioned, which don't take the form of lectures, but which take the form of anecdotes and jokes and stories in the novel. So to go back to the example of American movies, that's a very powerful form of using lies to tell some kind of a truth, or using lies in order to perpetuate further lies. That could also be one of the outcomes of great art as well. I will never forget meeting an Italian communist in Italy who really was opposed to American imperialism, but she loved Apocalypse Now, and she didn't see the contradiction between that, and that she could oppose American imperialism and yet enjoy a movie that silenced the very people, the Vietnamese, that she supported against American imperialism. And that made me understand again the power of stories to convey certain things. Now I hope that my fiction will be using lies fiction in order to convey a deeper truth. That's always, I think, part of our aspiration. So I started off as an academic, as a scholar. I don't know if I can really say that about myself any longer, but I'm convinced though that the work of academia, the hard work of uncovering history, of documenting, of archiving, all of that work has also been very important in the stories that I tell as well. So I wouldn't be able to tell some of my fiction, make up some of my lies, without some of the important work of scholarship too.
One more question, and we have to
Good
finish.
afternoon. I'm Luis Ma, and I'm a lecturer here in Lisbon. I have many questions, but I'm going to focus on two. First one, is there an Asian American literature or different types? I'm just what is your view about that? And the second one is, I have this perception that California is very important for when you talk about Asians in America. And I'm just wondering to what extent it also shapes the way you write, where you are based, the fact that you are in the other side of the Pacific, and how much it affects the way you write. Thank you.
Thank you. So I grew up in California, and I think that I'm as much a Californian as I am an American. I mean, California, I think by some measures, is the 5th largest economy in the world. So it is a state, but it's also its own kind of culture, its own kind of reality. And growing up in a state that's very multicultural, that's very fun to live in, the climate is like Portugal and so on. It made me, hope that the entire United States could one day be more like California than Florida, for example, or Texas. I don't know if that ever will happen. But I think that experience of growing up in a very multicultural place was absolutely important to writing my stories. But also, even as multicultural as California is, it still can't escape from some of the racism and some of the antagonisms that I've been describing. So I certainly encountered some of the racism when I was growing up in California as well. And I think the contrast between the racism and then the multicultural realities was very jarring. And so that made me, again, want to try to write fiction that would help bring a reality into being that was closer to the multicultural paradise that I thought California could be. When I was growing up, I didn't know that there was such a thing as Asian Americans. In fact, I remember going to a very elite high school, my high school, and it was mostly white high school, but some of us were of Asian descent, and we knew we were different This was the 1980s. But we just didn't know how to put it into words. So every day we would gather in a corner of our high school campus, those of us of Asian descent, and we would call ourselves the Asian Invasion. That was the only language we had for ourselves. And of course, that's the power of a lie, because Asians have never invaded the United States. If anything, it's the United States that has invaded Asia, right? So I had to get past that mythology, that propaganda, in order to understand myself as an Asian American. And the first book by an Asian American that I read, I think, was Amy Tan's The Joy Luck Club. I think I was 18 or 19. And I read it in about 2 nights, and I was like, oh my God, this is incredible. This is a book. Number one, it's a very well-written book. I loved it. But it's also written by someone who looks like me. And going to school at Berkeley at the time, it was my first time to encounter this term, Asian American. And I became immediately converted to being an Asian American. And I started to read Asian American literature and discovered that, in fact, Asian Americans have been writing in English since the 19th century in the United States. But it was still so rare that every time a book by an Asian American author was published, I would get very excited, and I would run and buy the book. And in the 1980s and 1990s, this would actually only happen once every year, that a book by an Asian American would come out. So it was very easy to keep track of Asian American literature. Now, literally almost every day, a new book by an Asian American author comes out. So Asian American literature, I don't think anyone can keep up with Asian American literature. So it could be turning into Jewish American literature at this point, where we have been so successful that our literature, I think everybody will have read something by an Asian American writer at this point, hopefully in the United States soon. So, which leads me to my last point, which is when I was trying to be a writer and becoming an Asian American in the 1990s, to be an Asian American was still an insurgent identity. We were still on the outside, clamoring for revolution, demanding change, and so on. Now, Asian Americans are about 6% of the American population. That's about 20 million people. We have Asian American books being published every day. We finally have Asian Americans on TV and in the movies with all kinds of interesting shows and movies and so on. And we have, Asian Americans in the highest levels of government and all that. And I'm thinking, maybe we now belong to the United States to a certain extent, and therefore, I don't want to be Asian American any longer. I would rather be on the outside looking in, because that's where my Asian American formation and identity was in the first place. And so now we've reached a very interesting moment where there are now people writing books like, saying Asian America is over. What does it mean to even be an Asian American? We're all confused, and so on and so forth. And so we've become, at this point, victims of our own success. And I think actually that's actually a very good thing, because 30 or 40 years ago, Asian Americans could all agree we're Asian Americans and we're fighting for the same thing. Now, Asian Americans, there are so many of us, we no longer agree on what it is that we're supposed to be about and what we're fighting for and so on. And is there really anything in common between me and an Asian American venture capitalist who supports the military-industrial complex? Not very much. And this is a very good moment, because now we can have an argument about what it is we really believe in, which is the argument that all Americans are having in general about being American and what the United States means. So it's a very interesting moment for Asian American literature and also for being Asian American as a whole, that I think we're at last at the moment where we can agree that being Asian American really doesn't mean that much anymore. Thank you very much. And thank you to Isabel for interviewing me. Thank you also to FLAD for having me as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Viet will go to sign the books outside, and will come in June with Valerio Luiselli. Thank you.
Thanks again. That was a lot of fun.